modelling. So this is, since it's public access, this is not Chatham House. So just a reminder to the panel, don't say anything you might regret. My editing skills aren't that great. What we'll do is we'll get into the discussion. So, okay, so risk officer sustainability panel discussion, moving from ESG theory to practice. So making the change, actually making this real. So the idea behind this panel discussion is to get into some of the practicalities of making ESG-related change happen, move from those conceptual ideas around sustainability to making a difference in reality. So it's intended to be a practical discussion. Please do ask questions in the chat. Charlotte, if you can keep an eye on those questions and just come in once in a while, that'd be helpful. What we're trying to get into is what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, any recommendations, hints and tips people may have for making sustainability transition and getting that into BAU and making that real. On the panel today, we have 3 distinguished risk experts. We're probably cringing at that. So we've got Ben Carr, who's Analytics and Capital Modelling Director at Aviva. Ben led the development of the CRO Forum's Mind Sustainability Gap report, which we'll come on to in a second. We have Alex Hindson, Chief Risk and Sustainability Officer at Argo. Alex has done lots of these, so I'm not going to go spend a huge amount of time on his CV and background. And Alex Duncan, Chief Risk Officer at Just Group, who's also done lots of these. So again, not going to spend lots of time, but they're all on LinkedIn, and so do feel free to drop them an invitation to connect. Whether they will or not, that's down to them. I think we've covered most of the things that we wanted to do as part of housekeeping, so we'll get into the discussion. So if it's okay, we'll start with you, Ben. That's your punishment for being slightly late. So you led development of the CRO Forum Mind the Sustainability Gap report. It'd be really good if you could just tell us a little bit more about that report and what its key findings were, and we'll go from there. Ben, you're on mute.
Schoolboy error. There
you go.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this roundtable. Yes, I mean, the CRO Forum, for those who are not aware, I mean, CRO Forum covers about 20 large insurers, mainly with a European footprint, not entirely with a primarily European footprint, but that's the sort of centre of gravity of the group. And they've established a sustainability working group, which we lead. And there was a lot of appetite, I think, to start to work together to flesh out what best practice looks like from an industry perspective when it comes to integrating sustainability risks into insurers' risk management frameworks. The paper does explore a little bit the sort of regulatory landscape and how things are changing, but the main focus was on internal risk management of sustainability issues. And I think it really starts from the discussions we had. One of the key areas that people are grappling with at the moment is, how it's not just about sort of the mechanics or the technical details of integrating sustainability risk, which is challenging. It's actually also how do you tie this into your organisation and governance arrangements, and how do you set out the roles and responsibilities in a way that really enables you to start to embed these risks into the way you manage the business day to day and into your strategy. So there's a lot of discussion around, do you want to have a centralized team looking at sustainability, which then tries to sort of push this out across the business, or do you need to sort of embed this into your existing functions and governance arrangements in order to make sure it's fully embedded? And I think one of the conclusions of the report is that may be something that you'll need to iterate. So you may well want to start with that more sort of centralized model at the beginning, but over time you'll probably want to really push this out into the businesses as it becomes more and more embedded. I think the second key discussion that was had was around risk appetite and sort of more generally, how do you embed sustainability risks into sort of risk identification, measurement, management, monitoring and reporting of sustainability risks. I think there was a recognition in that paper that we're probably not at the stage yet where you can have really, really hard sustainability risk appetite. So you're probably looking more at a sort of qualitative approach to setting risk appetite for sustainability, although there may well be areas, particularly when it comes to sort of climate risks, where you can start to sort of take a more quantitative approach. And there's quite a lot of discussion in the paper about the use of scenario analysis as a tool to potentially start to embed sort of climate and sustainability risks into the way that you make decisions and to support management actions. And then the report does then dive down into thinking about, well, what does this mean for underwriting? What does this mean for investments? What does it mean for operations? And there are some clear sort of overarching lessons to be learned for each of those areas, but then there are specifics. So, you know, I think for most companies, ESG is more embedded into investments at the moment than it is for underwriting. And, you know, for operations, there are a number of areas where I think it's becoming more embedded. So whether it's things like human rights, thinking about your supply chain and how you engage your supply chain, those are things that people are starting to focus on in the operations space. Diversity inclusion, so all of these areas, but it's quite sort of focused on specific issues at the moment. Perhaps you haven't got less of a holistic approach to thinking about sustainability risks. And then there's a couple of case studies that are included in the report, one on climate change, one on financial inclusion, just to show how this would work for specific issues. And I think one of the key things coming out of the paper was really the importance of double materiality. So that's the fact that you have sustainability risks, you know, both can impact you from sort of outside in, if you like. So, you know, you can have financial impacts on your balance sheet from sustainability risks, but equally the Actions UK can support sort of external societal sustainability goals. And it's how do you integrate sustainability into your risk management framework, taking into account this double materiality.
Okay. That's a really interesting concept that I must admit I hadn't come across prior to the previous discussion. Interesting that you were talking about embedding sustainability into different aspects of the organization. It just comes back, or brings back the question of, when we talk about sustainability in terms of your organization and what you've been doing, what do we actually mean by that? And where do we draw the kind of the perimeter of this? What does success look like in terms of a kind of completing transition and then into BAU?
Sorry, Chris, did you ask me there? There was a slide.
So, sorry, I don't mind. Whoever wants to pick that one up. It was kind of talking to Ben, but I don't mind if it's you want to have a go at that one.
Do you want to keep going, Ben?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Maybe I'll say something quickly, and I can hand over to you.
Sure.
I mean, certainly from an Aviva perspective, we've created something called the Aviva Sustainability Ambition, and we've created a program, cross Aviva program at Aviva to implement that. So that's led by Stephen Doherty, who's our Chief Corporate Responsibility and Brand Officer, but it has a number of projects that sit underneath it. So it's covering investments, underwriting, operations, risk and reporting. And by bringing this all together and making sure that we're doing this in a holistic way, we think that enables us to sort of join the dots. So I lead the climate risk work stream of that program, but that has really strong links with the investments work stream. So where we're looking to build our capability to assess transition and physical risk on corporate and private assets. And it also really links closely with the underwriting work stream. So, we're looking to develop new metrics at the moment to measure the carbon footprint of our underwriting portfolios. We're doing that in conjunction with peers and as part of the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. But we think that's, really, really important, because at the moment that's a bit of the big gap is, how do you measure the carbon impact of your underwriting activity? And then we're also working really closely with the reporting work stream. So we're seeing lots of requirements coming down the track around climate related financial disclosures for next year. And so we're going to have very granular reporting of our climate related risks, and we're going to have to go external on that, make sure that those are assured appropriately, and that's a big challenge, and we need to work really closely with the reporting teams to make sure we do that in a robust and safe way. And that also links on to our climate scenario analysis, where we've been developing a climate VAR metric that enables us to assess the climate risks that we're exposed to. And as many of you will know, that the TCFD requirements require you to do scenario analysis and to test the resilience of your strategy to different climate scenarios. I mean, I think the key lesson we've learned from the whole exercise to date is that you mustn't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. So don't be afraid to do what you can based on the data you have. Fail fast and make sure you seek to continuously improve what you're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, Alex, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, you heard Ben talk about having a sort of central ambition, and anyone who's heard me talk on this subject knows that I'm a firm believer in having an authentic sustainability strategy as the key risk mitigant that you can have in the organization. So you point the organization in a direction that everybody can get behind, and then you assign accountability for each leg, the same way as Ben has talked about. So overall, at Just, I think we're in quite a good place on articulating this and getting on with implementing it. Well, part of that embedding is making sure your risk framework is up to scratch for it. And the good news is that on the whole, risk frameworks could already accommodate the components of ESG. So if you think about the climate part, and you take climate as a cross-cutting issue, you can make sure that physical and transition aspects of climate are incorporated into your processes, which you then follow. Is then part of your own risk and solvency assessment. I think the bit of the framework that we've had to take more of a look at has been in the emerging risk process, and that's because the speed of change is so rapid, and making sure that all the relevant bits of the organisation are looking for that change and understanding what might contribute to a shift in the risk landscape as a result is really key. So looking at your capabilities and your processes around that in your existing framework is pretty important.
And the other Alex, any thoughts you want to come in on?
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree. I think at Argo, because we're a Bermudan headquartered company with a New York Stock Exchange listing, there's a slightly different kind of context, but essentially the key was to get a board level sponsor to get the ESG governance sorted out at board and committee level, so that you had the clarity of direction. What is it we're trying to achieve? What's the ambition that sets the program and enables me as the executive sponsor to get on with it and to report on progress and to nudge people who are maybe not quite on plan. So I think having that ambition, and I think possibly the challenge for us is, not wanting to put words in Ben's mouth, but we're not trying to be first quartile here. So we don't have a problem with perfection at all. So it's more a case of, given the resources we have, using the materiality assessment that we've done to allow us to not do things, so that we can do a few things well. And I think that's the danger, is that you look at the breadth of ESG and the sheer number of strands to it, and you can easily kind of be a rabbit in the headlights. And I think it's better to do 3 or 4 things well than to attempt 20 of them.
That's kind of where I was trying to get to with the question on was the perimeter to sustainability. There's so much that potentially could be included within the scope of that word. That how do you focus on what do you do and what do you decide not to do? Just picking up on what you just said, Alex, I assume that would have been a board discussion and a board decision as to that approach, and decisions taken to do stuff or not to do stuff would have been put in front of them, presumably.
Yes, but as I think most people will realise with anything that has quite a technical element, is you have to start with education for the board, so that they're actually qualified to have an opinion on that. So I think yes, but I think what we've tried to do is by identifying a few key KPIs, key performance indicators, is to say, okay, what influences these key performance indicators? That's where we're going to put the effort. and it's okay to not do certain things. And the, practical example I use is one of the companies that has an ESG index that follows Argo, under the environment score, has quite a few questions and detail about toxic waste. So I know that as an insurance company, the two most toxic waste streams in our organization are printer ink and coffee granules. So I don't think that's a big issue. But it's one of these situations where if you don't have a policy, a process, and a huge amount of documentation, you don't get the points. And we've made the conscious decision to say, we're going to leave those points on the table, because it might be in their scoring system, but it doesn't make sense for us.
Yeah.
And Chris, the point of being able to articulate a strategy is in some way to draw the boundaries around what you're going to do. So we can't be all things to all people. It's not appropriate for us to be all things to all people. If we pick the things that we can influence, or the areas that we operate, and say this is what we're focusing on, then that gives you a set of boundaries. Now, of course, the external world doesn't necessarily respect those boundaries when it comes to the risk it generates for you, which is why you've got to have your eye on what's going on outside. So there's a great example in the press this week of Pfizer trying to do the right thing with regard to promoting ethnic minorities, and it's now being sued for not including white people and Asian Americans in the program that they have. So they were on the right track, but they fell over some federal legislation, which has got them a criminal case against them. So that's why, even though you say, here's my boundary, I'm doing the right thing, you've got to make sure you understand if even in doing the right thing, the social attitudes or the way that the policy or law is moving isn't going to work against you. It's a really tough balance.
It's extremely tough. It's very, very difficult to get things right, because everyone has an opinion, and you're not going to get complete consensus on decisions being made. Interesting that Alex's point. You can see the combination of things here. So define a sustainability strategy so that everyone is clear in which direction you're traveling and what you're aiming to do, and therefore what you're not aiming to do. Setting KPIs, which I assume you would link into that strategy. If you measure it, it will happen, sort of thing. If you don't measure it, it won't happen. But is there then the risk that you're almost greenwashing, in that you've picked KPIs that are being monitored externally and that you can deliver on? Where does that take the organization from a true kind of sustainability strategy position? Or is this simply the practical implementation of sustainability? You've got to make these decisions, therefore that's an approach to do it. Anybody want to come in on that? Ben?
Yeah,
I'm happy to talk about. Go on, Ben.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah. So I'd say the key there is thinking about what Alex talked about, is where you can have most impact. So I think when you're setting that strategy and saying where you're going to focus, you should start by saying, where can we have most impact? I think if you do that, then that should avoid you, just focusing on the things you can measure, as opposed to the things where, it's important for you to take action. I think once you've done that, then you need to think through, what are the KPIs that I can use to track and sort of monitor whether I am having an impact in those key areas. The challenge is, though, and there's always that sort of challenge with targets, is that no KPI is going to be perfect, so it's not going to perfectly measure the impact you're having in that particular area. So I do think you have to be really careful that you effectively don't then end up over sort of managing to that specific KPI, which could have unintended consequences, and is really much more an indicator of the extent to which you really are focusing your efforts in those areas where you think it's most, you can have the most bang for your buck.
Okay.
And equally, if you take the other approach and say, look, here's a whole range of indicators that Sustainalytics or MSCI or S&P or whoever it is are focusing on, and I'll just take the actions that maximize those, you have no authenticity. So you're going to end up tripping over yourself, because the story you tell about what you're doing will be different from your actions. Or you'll be called up because you're doing something that is is not in line with something else happening in your business. It's very difficult to sort of hold that story together.
It does strike me that authenticity is key here, which, kind of jumping around a little bit, takes us back to the board and how bought in is the board to this. So is there a learning here in that if you're going to do sustainability, the board's got to be fully behind it, and it's not just a box ticking or kind of a marketing activity. It's got to be an authentic activity. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely right. And the board should be thinking about the impact of its decisions on the sustainability and the sustainability strategy every time it makes one. So putting something in the board papers that prompts that. So we put a question in for anybody who's writing an executive or board paper to say, to what extent have you considered sustainability, or how does this align with the sustainability strategy? So that they're forced to articulate that, and the board is forced to engage on it.
Okay. Kind of following question. I'm not sure what the answer to this is. Are people seeing ESG leads sat on boards? So a NED with some kind of responsibility for leading the ESG kind of piece, or being the representative for that, in the same way that you'd have a workforce representative or a workforce NED on a board, and you'd have that kind of thing happening. Is that something that people are seeing? No.
Who are you aiming at that
I don't mind. I mean, it's just a broad question.
We have a non-executive responsible for sustainability.
Oh, you
yes.
Do, right.
And
Okay.
it's somebody who's responsible because they have an interest in the topic,
Mm-hmm.
and they've been in their own personal journey, been following the sustainability agenda and working out what they can do in their own personal lives.
Mm.
It's not somebody who's come from an ESG type background in business. There's quite a shortage of those. So finding senior people to sit in non-executive positions because of their sustainability credentials is not yet an easy exercise.
No. Okay.
We have a board. We have a board sponsor, and it's one of the senior non-execs, and they don't necessarily have a background.
Okay. And Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think our strategy is certainly being signed off, discussed, approved at board level. So there's strong engagement there, and as part of, we've been doing a lot of work to look at updating terms of reference of board committees and risk policies and other policies across the business to make sure they're capturing sort of sustainability, including climate related risks. So absolutely, that's really important that you've got that sort of senior level engagement and oversight, I think.
Yeah, I was just trying to explore the authenticity point. That was also, it's interesting to see that there is either someone with sustainability attached to them in terms of broadly their NED role, or broader board engagement on it. Now, in the prep for this webinar, Ben, I'm going to come back to you, I'm afraid, sorry. You mentioned Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials and the UN-convened Net Zero Insurance Alliance. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about that and what impact that might have, you think, going forwards?
Yeah, sure. So we've published our first climate transition plan this year, and as part of that, we've committed to reduce our emissions to net zero in operations supply chain by 2030, and in our investments and underwriting by 2040. As I said, one of the key challenges we've identified as part of that is that currently there really aren't any sort of generally accepted market practices for measuring insurance associated emissions for your underwriting portfolios. So you have metrics for operations, you have metrics for investments, but you don't really have metrics that you can even track for underwriting portfolios. And the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which is part of GFANS, which is a wider group of financial services companies that was developed as part of the following on from COP 26, have set out a commitment to develop sort of metrics for sort of the carbon footprint of underwriting portfolios, and they're doing that in consultation with the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, who've done a lot of work on finance emissions on the investment side. They issued a consultation in the summer, which was looking at how you might do this for commercial lines and for personal lines motor as a first step. And they're looking to then take the feedback from that consultation and publish an initial standard later this year. I think they're hoping they can hit the COP27 deadline for that. But I think this is going to be really important, in terms of, once you've got a metric, then you can start to think about how you might set targets against that. And you can also use it to think about, the trajectory that your insurance lines are going to follow. So, the first thing you really need to do if you're going to do that is understand, given government commitments, government policy, and also, sort of customer behaviour, how are emissions likely to evolve for your, for example, personal lines motor over the next 10, 15, 20 years, notwithstanding, whatever you do, just through virtue of the fact you insure the motor market. And then, then what actions above and beyond that, if you need to sort of bend that trajectory downwards to meet your stated targets, then what are the actions that you could take to try and sort of bend that curve? So that could be advocating for governments to do more, to have sort of more, if you like, sort of more ambitious policy actions. It could be by engaging with clients to encourage, to make climate conscious choices. May come through sort of product innovation. Could come through sort of optimization of business mix, for example, on the commercial lines area, where you may be looking to sort of ensure the transition. And it may also come through sort of engagement with clients in terms of, ultimately you could be engaging with your, automotive clients through your investments to, encourage them to, make sure that they've got science-based targets, initiative back plans and strategies to ensure that the carbon emissions of their vehicles are going to come down over time, and or that they're looking to decarbonize supply chains as well. So I think once these standards are out there and we start to have metrics to measure carbon footprint and underwriting portfolios, I think this could be a really, it could be have a really big impact in terms of people's net zero strategies, and how you really sort of embed that sort of the key element, I guess, of any insurer, which is the insurance that you're providing to your customers and clients.
Okay, thank you. I must admit I wasn't aware of that alliance, so it's useful to bring that up. And at that point, I think we'll probably move to Alex, if that's okay. Alex Hindson, in terms of responsible underwriting.
Yeah, it's quite a good segue. Because I'm actually talking about the bit that Ben's just said is the difficult bit. so I will protect myself, safe harbor, by saying I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you about what we're doing and what we're thinking about. I think the thing I've reflected on is we think this is a journey, and we're not in a tearing rush. We kind of know what the outcome is, but we don't really know what the process is yet, as Ben suggested. And I think also, I'm not sure we agree with the rush to kind of create a carbon accounting approach. I think we actually think the objective is to integrate ESG into underwriting, not climate accounting into underwriting. And so I may be a little bit contrarian on that. But I actually think what we want to do is look at all of E, S, and G in the risk selection and pricing of our policies, and not get too obsessed about just carbon. And part of the reason is that we can actually do something about that right now, as opposed to some of the challenges I'm going to talk about in terms of actually getting numbers for around carbon. So I'm also seeing that, in some ways the regulator is not helping. I mean, they've given us a big push here, which is good, but this kind of carbon obsession is making this more of a technical problem and a quant problem than an underwriter owned problem. And I think what we're kind of grappling with is what is a typical enterprise risk management problem, which is, the answer is not driven by controls alone. We need to tackle the cultural element as well. And just a really simple, silly example is if you put together a fossil fuel statement and it becomes a rule, then unfortunately some of the behaviors you might encounter are people trying to understand the boundaries of that fossil fuel statement and how they get around it. And I think what you've got to kind of sit down with people is explain, okay, why do you think we have a fossil fuel statement? What's the context? What are we trying to achieve? And not the letter of the law, which, inevitably, whenever you write down a set of rules, you might not get the words quite right. But the intent should be understood by everyone in the organization, because you're basically, a lot of the downside risk management, and I'll come on to opportunities in a minute, a lot of the downside risk management is about protecting the brand and reputation of the organization as a whole, and not one particular piece of the organization. So I think there's a danger of losing big picture here if we get into the carbon accounting. It's got to be done, but it's just about keeping it in its rightful place. So we've been looking at piloting the use of ESG data to inform underwriting, and just to give you a bit of context, we're a P&C insurer, property casualty. We are a specialty insurer, mostly focused on the US risks. And the first challenge is having the data. So we've looked at a couple of data providers. First thing we did was to work with our data analytics team and give them, the list of our insureds and say, okay, what's your coverage ratio? And, talking to kind of peers in the Lloyd's market, 10% is quite a good hit rate, which is quite concerning, because if you compare that to investments, you might be up at 60-70%. And we've been comparing a couple, and one of the data providers can get up into the high 20s and maybe 30%. Another data provider is actually overcoming that by essentially creating proxy data, so they can get into the 60s and 70% coverage. But when you kind of pick at it, you suddenly realize it's not real data. What they've done is said, we've got these 10 interesting factors about this company, and from that we will infer an ESG score. And so it's a black box. And we're starting to have some quite interesting debates about, if you were to put out numbers for your call it your scope 3 underwriting footprint, your kind of insured emissions, and 90% of those numbers are inferred or estimated, that there's going to have to be a pretty healthy health warning on the bottom of that, because what will happen over time, and we've seen this just with our own scope 1 and 2, is you end up restating your baseline year every year, because your process gets better, data gets better, your validation gets better. And so there's a balance to be struck. There's a risk appetite discussion about, how far do you go? Do you just report on what you're confident on and maybe get a rap on the knuckles for not having gone far enough, or do you do your best efforts and then you're potentially going to be in some kind of litigation for misrepresentation, especially if you're in a US kind of environment? So I think that's an interesting problem, but I think fundamentally what we're trying to do is marry the quant and the qual and take the underwriters with us. So what we've learned from that is focus on the outcome, the process will evolve over time. And it's really about integrating ESG thinking into underwriting, which involves a lot of conversations and education, and actually managing, like this might sound odd, but managing uncertainty. The underwriters get worried if they're not in control of their process. And so you've almost got to reassure them that this isn't taking the pen away, it's actually helping them make a better decision. And at the end of the day, you've also got to focus on opportunities. So it's not just a case of here's a long list of things we can't do anymore. It's also from transition risk, where are there opportunities to write new business? Where can I grow my book? And how can we look at that in the round? And I think some of that is done more at the portfolio level than at the individual insured. So I'll stop there.
So from what I'm hearing this is a substantial change to the way that the business needs to operate. So it's not just a bit of tweaking of the underwriting process, it's significant, it's cultural, it's a big change process. And you know, that's going to be challenging, and any change process, particularly when it comes down to culture and people and behaviors, is difficult.
Well,
Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to agree with you, but it's basically, you know, there's a temptation to say, oh, bish bash bosh, here's a climate number.
Yeah.
But then what do you do?
Yeah. Okay. Alex or Ben, did you have any thoughts on what Alex just said? Any comments you'd like to make? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just come back on the. So I'd probably agree. I agree totally with Alex. So, you know, climate change is just one element. So, you know, we've got in terms of our strategy from a sustainability perspective, it's got 3 strands. There's acting on climate change, but then there's also building stronger communities and embedding ESG into the business and decision making. So absolutely, you want to have that. You need to have that broader view. I think that I don't see it as an either or really. So the key for us is, if you want to act on climate change, then and you believe that's one of those areas where you can have impact, which we do, then you know you need the metrics to help measure and drive that change. So I suppose that's the only point I'd make.
Okay, and I'm going to come to Alex Duncan now. In terms of just in terms of the audience, I know we got a heavily insurance focused panel. We're trying to keep the learnings a bit broader than just insurance. But so we're going to come to Alex around investment decisions, broadly speaking. I'm not going to constrain what he wants to say, but just wanted to ask in terms of you know, where are you in terms of the sustainability journey at the moment, and you know some of the key learnings that you've had in going along that journey.
Sure. So where to start on all of that? So firstly, just to explain to people, so I work in a life insurance company, and it's a life insurance company that focuses very much on retirement. So when we think about liabilities, we're thinking about how long people live, and the one thing we can be sure about, at least the climate change agenda, is people will either live less than they do now or more than they do now, but we don't know which. So spending a lot of time worrying about life insurance liabilities and trying to underwrite people for climate change, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. What that means is a lot of our effort is in our investment side, and then of course we've got the rest of our scope 3 in terms of supply chain. And the challenges that Ben and Alex have laid out with regard to getting hold of data, etc., are exactly the same. You know, we have to rely a lot on proxy data. There are gaps of complete unavailability. So trying to transition plan from here is difficult. But I'm not sure that we face quite as hard a job in getting our investment people to begin to move their thinking as perhaps the underwriters do. You know, underwriters have or Alex does with underwriters. And that's because the concept of responsible investing has been around a bit longer, and has been adopted, you know, reasonably, you know, for a reasonable amount of time in various organisations. So you can go all the way back to companies like, you know, Friends Provident with their Quaker roots, who would be thinking about the degree of responsibility in their investment management, or you know, some of the Dutch companies who were on this quite early on. And so the acceptance in the investment community is a little bit easier. But what that doesn't mean, though, is it doesn't mean we can just change everything overnight. So you know, you're starting with a portfolio that is not going to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And even if we had, you know, a series of perfect investments out of there from an ESG perspective, we couldn't switch into them immediately. Aside from anything else, there aren't enough of them, and everybody's competing for them. And then what that means is that the spread on them is quite tight as well. So it would be quite detrimental, both for value for money for our policyholders and also for return for our shareholders to try and do that. So that's a non-starter. We've got to keep the security of our policyholders absolutely top priority. We've got to be paying claims in 40 or 50 years. So we can't go and take a punt on the next, a big punt on the next tidal project that comes up and put equity capital into that. That's not on. We've got to be looking at investment grade credit assets. And so that means we're going to be relatively late in being involved in the transition in the real economy overall. As I said, we've got to make returns for shareholders, and our capital providers expect and demand a return for the risks that they're taking. Now, at the simplest level, less risk means less return, right? So a company who is satisfying its shareholders that will be there in the long term should have a lower cost of capital. But again, it's not something that we can make. We can't make an immediate transition on. And we can't all, we expect that the asset portfolio will have to adjust over time. We do think about social implications on the ESG side. So as a life insurer, we decided fairly early on that tobacco wasn't a great thing to be investing in, given the correlation between that and shortened longevity. And then we take a view on social and human rights implications of other investments. But we also have to remember that the climate transition in particular shouldn't leave other communities high and dry. So disinvestment as an option is one that you have to think about quite carefully. Equally, it may be that you're investing in something that looks like it's a good green project, but there are social implications behind it that you haven't considered. So that's got to be built into thoughts as well. And then I suppose finally, just thinking about reputation, reputation is probably the fastest potential destroyer of a company. Over and above everything else. It certainly won't be, it's certainly unlikely to be climate risk that destroys a life insurance company promptly. But reputation could. So we have to make sure that we're being seen to be doing what we say we are at the highest level. So it's difficult to build an argument that says, well, we know we said we were doing this, but this exception is really well justified because by the time you get to this exception, people's ears have glossed over and they say you're not doing what you said you were going to do. So all of these things are going into this ESG type investment decision mix all the time. And ultimately where we're trying to get to is have our credit analysts, guided by our sustainability experts, our credit analysts having a framework that is both ESG and fundamental credit. And so they're looking at everything holistically.
Okay. Alex or Ben, do you have any thoughts or comments you want to come in on there? No. What was interesting from my perspective there was kind of its climate versus the broader ESG agenda in those decisions, because it's very easy to say climate wins out. We've got to focus on that because all the legislative focus on that at the moment. But how do you actually trade off those decisions, those things, social versus climate versus whatever else? How do you rank those things in terms of how you make your decisions? We're trying to give people recommendations, hints and tips here, so I'm not I don't know what process you've been through, but I mean, is there anything that we can share?
Ambiguity is almost the biggest enemy in this, because we just at some level we don't know what we don't know. So what's the antidote for ambiguity when you're making decisions? And it has to be transparency. And that I think if you find yourself as an organization coming across something where you're making a decision that might be a little bit controversial, then finding a way to promote and explain how you've arrived at that decision is important. And I suspect that, and I'm not sure about this, but I suspect that in due course, one of the things that will happen through sustainability reporting is people may begin to showcase certain investments and say, look, we had to make this, we made this decision in this investment because it's doing this great good thing. But at the same time, probably have to say, equally, we acknowledge that, or we decided this because. And I'll use an example. This week, there's been quite a lot in the press around fracking. And there was a letter in, I forget it was the Guardian or the FT, from people who, two individuals who used to work for a fracking company, one of whom is now involved in a thermal water project. The idea there is that you pump water out of hot water aquifers under the seabed, use it to heat greenhouses, and then return it to the sea. The challenge with that, I mean, there are lots of good benefits from an energy perspective, but the challenge is what harm are you doing to marine life? Because protecting marine life is one of the sustainable goals. So at some point, someone's going to have to, if we're going to finance these projects, someone's going to have to make a call that says, look, we've done the scientific work. We believe it's not going to have an impact, but we just don't know. And this is part of the challenge with all of the sustainability agenda, and particularly when it comes to climate and transition. We just don't know what's going to happen. So we're making decisions. We're taking choices that will be better in some dimensions and maybe worse in others. And we're weighing up something that's a very grey area instead of something that's black and white.
It is interesting. So just on that point, so desalination. So we look at the spread of desalination plants. So you can produce hydrogen as you desalinate, and obviously fresh water as well. But the byproduct is heavily salinated water, which you pump into the sea and actually destroys marine life. So you're doing all the right things to, produce renewable energy and all those types of things, but you end up causing pollution at the same time. So it's balancing those things and understanding what impacts there are. And inevitably, I think as time goes by, exactly as you say, science will discover that some of the decisions we're making at the moment probably aren't great because they have side effects that we weren't aware of or hadn't focused on sufficiently. Right, we're coming to the end of our time. We've got a few more minutes left. So I was going to come to each of you, and this is kind of the million-dollar question, I guess. So what are the prerequisites for, firstly, a successful sustainability transformation program, and secondly, for embedding sustainability into BAU? And also, a follow-on question, what does success look like? What is the target end state? So who wants to go first with that unanswerable question? Ben, you're smiling. I'm sorry, I'm going to come to you, Ben. So, so what are the prerequisites for successful sustainability transformation and embedding sustainability in BAU, and what does success look like? Oh, you're on mute.
So I think that the first thing that I would say is really important is just senior management board sort of sponsorship, awareness, engagement for the strategy. Without that, I think you're not gonna get anywhere. And I think it's then also making sure that you clearly setting out at your strategic level how sustainability is integrated into your purpose. An overall approach as a business. Without that, again, I think you're going to struggle to really make meaningful change. I think then the second thing is, ultimately, you need to embed this across the business in all functions. You really need. I think the idea that you can do this have a BAU model where you have a sustainability group of people who know a lot about sustainability but aren't that close to the business. I don't see that can deliver a successful strategy in all the areas you need it. Ultimately, what you need to do is, you need to build ESG capability, understanding into your underwriting, investment, operations processes. You need the experts in those areas to be sort of really living and breathing ESG and thinking about how to integrate into their activities and their work. Without that, again, I just don't think you'll ultimately succeed. Doesn't mean there isn't a key role for sort of a central group when you're sort of building out and transforming. I can see strong rationale for that, particularly at the moment, given there isn't necessarily huge amounts of capability out there of people who are very expert in sustainability and also financial services experts. So I can see a strong role in the short term, but in the long term, I think you need to embed it. You need that capability across the business if you're going to have a successful strategy. And I do think, there's a lot to do in the collaboration space. So there's a lot of data metrics that needs to be developed if we're going to really manage these risks properly and appropriately across all aspects of the financial services work stream. So I think that is another key criteria that needs to be developed if we're going to be successfully integrate sustainability into financial services.
Thank you. Alex, Duncan, you're not on mute, so I'll come to you.
Ben, I think has covered most of the things that I would have touched on. I mean, we've talked about the authentic strategy as a guiding tool. We've talked about accountability for it. Perhaps one of the traits that is more difficult for big organizations is adaptability. You know, Alex touched on the challenge of getting people to change what they're doing because they feel threatened by it. And a combination of accountability, not just for things going wrong, but accountability for making decisions on the ground and defending them, and then the adaptability of an organization to be able to say, okay, we need to pivot and go in this direction, or we need to change our processes to do this. Those two things together, I think, will be a big part of the success of organizations that make it to the end of this journey.
And that's difficult, isn't it? So, you know, board engagement, board ownership, setting the strategy, those are all things that can be achieved relatively easily. An adaptable or an agile organization that's intrinsic to the organization, and that's difficult to suddenly change and to introduce. But interesting. It'll have impacts on how well you do. Alex Hindson, we'll give you the last few words. Prerequisites for a successful transformation in BAU. And
I think good change management. It's all about change management, and not only the affecting the change, but the nature of the change might change as you move, which is the point that Alex Duncan made, because the world outside isn't static. So I think in some ways you almost got to stand back and look at the portfolio level and say, okay, what shape of business do we want, and how might that change over time, rather than getting too obsessed by the detail of every transaction you do, because you know, there's, as everybody said, there's trade-offs. Then there isn't simple maths that says, you know, one social issue is worth two environmental issues. It's a decision-making framework with limited information. So that's why there's a cultural element and a buy-in element.
Okay, thank you. We didn't really get very many questions in the chat that I can see. Have I missed any there? Brian Foss mentioned double materiality. Mentioned risk committee chairs, but no other questions in the chat at the moment. Okay, so at that point, what I will do is, unless anybody has any questions that they'd just like to raise, I think we'll probably wrap up at that point. Thank you to our panelists for a really interesting conversation, and I know some of the questions were fairly challenging. The answers are also challenging, so I think that's where we are with ESG and sustainability. Nothing's easy, and we're all learning as we move. We will, following this call, we will send out an email to all the participants, all the audience members, with a link to the recording and also a link to the Risk Coalition website with the blog of the last discussion, and also yesterday's blog that was published. And if you have any suggestions for future Risk Officer Sustainability Forum discussions, do get in touch. Do let us know what you think we could usefully bring to the table as either a round table discussion or one of these public access panel discussions. That'd be helpful. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.